Right. So I have a little thing I'm just kind of rereading. My pleasure to welcome Ingrid. Thanks, Ingrid, for coming. Ingrid received her PhD from Ohio State University, working with Will Cunningham, even though he's now actually at University of Toronto. So she actually has a psychology background, which is important for what I'm going to be saying in a few seconds. Then she was hired at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln in 2012, and she's now an associate professor there running the Political Attitudes and Cognition Lab. So she actually has a joint appointment in both psychology and political science. I believe political science is her home base, but then she has like a courtesy appointment in psychology, but does a lot of work and knows those people. And reflecting these joint appointments, I regularly see Ingrid at psychology conferences. She's a regular attendee, but I know that she's also a regular presenter and attendee at political science conferences. This is why I thought that she'd be great to give a presentation here, because she is multidisciplinary, both in her theoretical background, but also in her methodological approach that seemed like a good fit for the CEDC, CSDC. And with that, thanks for coming, Ingrid, and pushing through your second vaccine shot, and you can take it away.
Okay, great. So thanks very much, Eric, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. I really appreciate the invitation to share some of my work with you. So the work I'm going to be talking about today comes from a line of research that we've been doing broadly in the domain of political neuroscience. So using neuroscience and psychology to investigate questions in political behavior. And so I'm going to give you kind of an introduction overview of some of that work that we've been doing today. There's been a lot of attention paid to political polarization in recent years, both in the US and elsewhere. There have been arguments among both psychologists and political scientists in terms of both the extent to which it's happening and whether or not it's worse now than it has been at other points in American political history. But there's at least some evidence that people are increasingly divided on politics, both in terms of where they stand and their willingness to tolerate people who disagree with them politically. Polarization by itself isn't necessarily a problem, but it often leads to a decrease in support for democratic norms like tolerance and moderation. There's some evidence that this is happening not just among the public, but among elected officials as well, and some have argued that the polarization in Congress in the US is even more extreme. In a representative democracy, of course, citizens are responsible for electing and monitoring officials. So part of the motivation for this line of work is the idea that if we want to decrease polarization and partisanship, we need to understand how people evaluate candidates and officials, especially perhaps in cases where those officials deviate from party line, given that this is often a necessary precondition for compromise. So this is just a brief overview of what I'm going to focus on in the talk today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what we already know about how people evaluate political information that's incongruent and or uncertain. And then I'm going to move into talking about how we can evaluate this using neuroscientific methods specifically, and I'm going to focus on functional MRI in the talk today. And I'll show you some data. First, on how people process incongruent and or uncertain information, and I'll look at the interaction of these two factors and the type of information that we process. And then I'll talk a little bit about ideological differences in political cognition and neural processing of this information in particular. I'll then finish by talking, just giving a brief summary and talking a bit about implications and future directions. And I should say, happy to stop and take questions throughout. If people do have clarifying questions, feel free to stop me. Otherwise, I'm happy to also take questions at the end. So whatever the norm is for the group works fine for me. Okay, so let's start by looking at what we already know about this question. In thinking first about how people should evaluate incongruent information in this context, there are at least two relevant literatures to consider. First is the idea that political identification, whether that might be party or ideology, functions as a schema, a stereotype, and or an identity. So from psychology, we know that we pay attention to things that are both congruent and incongruent with social stereotypes, and politics is no exception. So you can think of party or ideology as operating as a social group, but also as a schema or what's called a stereotype in psychology. From the neuroscience literature, there is some example work showing that people do attend to expectancy violations, so deviations from stereotypes in both person perception and social judgment. So for example, this work by Cloutier and colleagues in 2011 showed that people in an fMRI study, that people, when they were engaged in evaluating social targets, that there was greater activation in a couple of regions in the brain, temporal parietal junction and medial PFC. These are regions involved in person perception when people were evaluating incongruent targets. So some evidence from the neuroscience literature that people are attending to this, and this is reflected in neural activation. Second, from social psychology, we might think that this should be more likely to draw attention when people are motivated and information is personally relevant. So from the attitudes literature, we know that people are more likely to engage with information, for example, when they're both motivated to do so and have the ability to do so. And one of the factors that can increase that attention paid to information is this idea of personal relevance. Now, in the context of the present work, I'm going to suggest that maybe this might mean people are going to pay more attention to in-group or same-party targets than out-group or out-party targets. And we'll look at that in the data a little bit later in the talk. There is some previous work in the realm of political neuroscience that's used fMRI to just see what's happening when participants evaluate or look at in-group versus out-group candidate faces. In this study, participants just saw faces, so they weren't making any sort of decision. They were just looking at faces while they were in the scanner. And they did find that people showed greater activation in some regions associated with cognitive control, including anterior cingulate cortex or ACC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or PFC, when viewing in-group compared to out-group candidate faces. Now, in the study, or in the paper, I should say, they interpreted this as cognitive control or emotion regulation, but we don't actually know that from the task that they did in the scanner. So people were just looking at faces, and we don't really know necessarily what they were thinking about when they were doing that. But this is at least some initial evidence that maybe people do attend more to these in-group candidate faces than they do to out-group candidate faces.
Can I ask a clarification question, Ingrid?
Yeah, please do.
So how did you signal that they were in and out group members when they were looking at the faces? Was there like a sign of which party they belong to, or so just clarifying that?
Yeah, so I will, this is a paper from Kaplan and colleagues. That's not my work. So off the top of my head, I actually don't remember for sure how they signaled it. I think there was probably some sort of a label on the screen, but I don't remember how they did it in that study. I will talk in a couple minutes about how we did this in our study. So hopefully that will be clear.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. Any other questions so far? Okay. So let's look next at work on uncertainty I'm going to talk about this again, kind of from the perspective of both political science and psychology here. Uncertainty has been argued to be an inherent part of the political process. So this is not, I'm not the first person to say that uncertainty is important here, but the effects of uncertainty are not always clear. So behavioral research shows mixed findings. In some cases, people may be less likely to rely on uncertain information to evaluate political candidates. In other cases, work has shown that they evaluate that information negatively, and sometimes work has shown the opposite, so that it can even be neutral or positive in some contexts. So there's not really a clear finding, at least from my reading of the political science literature, in terms of how uncertainty plays a role. And perhaps when you kind of turn to the psychology or the political psychology literature, that's not all that surprising. So uncertainty, I would argue, is a diffuse affective state signaling any sort of lack of information. Uncertainty is often thought of as negative, and it's often been looked at in line with negative emotion or negative situations, but uncertainty by itself is not inherently negative. So uncertainty can also be attached to positive information. Sometimes things are just surprising. Sometimes they're even exciting if you're if you're thinking about uncertainty surrounding something positive. So imagine, going on a first date or something like that. That's a situation that's uncertain, but it could turn out either way, right? It could turn out to be positive or it could turn out to be negative. The idea here is that uncertainty by itself isn't necessarily negative, although there may be individual variation in that. Uncertainty, what we've shown in some past work is that uncertainty can lead to either open or closed-minded cognition, depending on the associated affective context. So we have a couple of papers out there where we've looked at uncertainty in relation to positive and negative emotion. And in particular, in this work, we focused on uncertainty as it's related to threat. So we find that if uncertainty is paired with threat, so in situations where you're talking about an uncertain threat specifically, people tend to respond more with closed-minded cognition. So they show a reduction in political tolerance. We've also shown that they're less supportive of political compromise. On the other hand, if uncertainty is not paired with threat, so it's either paired with a neutral control condition or it's paired with positive affect, we basically find the opposite. So uncertainty in those cases is actually more likely to produce an increase in open-minded cognition, so make people more thoughtful and more likely to engage with information. So a couple things to say here, I guess. I haven't really talked about the political psychology literature on anxiety, but I'm happy to talk more about that maybe at the end if people have questions. I know that there is more work on that in political psychology. I don't think that work is always very clear in terms of how they're defining anxiety. So I think some of that work maybe is talking about uncertainty, and maybe sometimes it's talking about anxiety. So that's kind of a problem in that political psychology literature, that we're not always clear on the definition. So that work may be relevant here too, is really all I wanted to mention. In the context of the work I'm going to talk about today, I'm telling you about this because we're going to use this to argue that uncertainty may look different when attached to congruent versus incongruent information. So information that's either consistent or inconsistent with basically the party stereotype. And I will talk more about how we did that in this work. Are there any other questions so far? Okay. So I'm going to move into talking next about how we can look at this with fMRI in particular, and how we developed our research design. So in this work, we use functional MRI or fMRI to examine how people respond to both incongruent and or uncertain information in the domain of political evaluation. To do this, we use a task where people are evaluating policy issues attributed to hypothetical political candidates. We're less interested in the candidates themselves in this study. We're more interested in this as kind of a delivery mechanism for looking at information that varies in uncertainty and that varies in congruence. And I'll talk more about how we did that exactly in just a minute. So we recruited 58 adult participants from Lincoln, Nebraska area. Some of these were students, but there were also some older adults in the sample. So the age range was 15 up to about 60, the average age 25. And this was a sample that it was pretty evenly split in terms of liberals and conservatives. So we made an effort to recruit conservatives so that we wouldn't end up with kind of the typical liberal college student sample. In Nebraska, it's actually pretty easy to recruit a balanced sample because we do have a good mix of liberals and conservatives, both on campus and kind of in the surrounding area. So we do have a sample that's pretty well balanced in terms of political ideology. The research design was within subjects rapid event-related design. And if you're not up on MRI lingo, I will try to explain what that means. Event-related design just means that we're modeling brain activity at the trial level. So people are making a series of decisions, and I'll kind of explain that more in a minute. And we're looking at what the brain is doing when they're making each of those decisions. The rapid in that design lingo just means that people are making decisions kind of every each decision is about 5 seconds or so that they have to consider this. And then they do a block or a set of trials that last for, I'd say, 6 or 7 minutes. So they're making a bunch of these decisions pretty quickly about a hypothetical candidate. Participants, so each block focused on a hypothetical political candidate. All participants saw 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. We also measure participant ideology. So it works out such that all participants are seeing 2 what we call in-group candidates and 2 out-group candidates, and that's in a randomized order. So it's kind of, it shows up randomly for each person. So in each block of trials, they're focused on one of these 4 candidates, and then in each block, they complete 48 trials. So they're making 48 decisions basically within that block of trials about each candidate. On each trial, participants are presented with a policy position attributed to that candidate, and it's either congruent or incongruent with the candidate's party. So they're told that the candidate supports or opposes the issue, and this appears first. So I don't know, can you see my mouse if I do that? Okay. So the Q appears first. You're told if they support or oppose the issue, and then our manipulation of uncertainty is whether we tell them that they definitely or may support or oppose the issue. So that's fully crossed. It either says definitely or may and supports or opposes. That appears on screen for 750 milliseconds prior to the policy statement. The policy statement then appears. And then in most cases, this would be consistent with party identification. So most of the time, our candidates support issues that are consistent with their party or oppose issues that their party doesn't usually support. But then we have a smaller number of trials that are incongruent, where the candidate supports something that is inconsistent with the party, or they're opposed to something that the party usually would support. What participants are doing is telling us whether that's good or bad that the candidate has that position on the issue. So they're making what we call an evaluative judgment. We didn't really define for them what that should mean. We basically just said, you tell us whether you think this is good or bad. We wanted them to be doing something while they're in the scanner, and we wanted to focus them on evaluative or attitudinal processing. So we wanted them to be thinking about whether this was good or bad, and that's why we gave them this type of decision to make in the scanner. So the Q is there for 750 milliseconds, and then the statement's up for 40 to 50 milliseconds. So the total is 5 seconds. That's actually a pretty quick decision that participants are having to make. So they kind of have to go with their initial response. They're not having a lot of time to think about that. Okay, so in terms of the variables of interest, we then can look at what we call block type, and this is whether participants see an in-group or an out-group political candidate. Again, they see 4 different candidates, so 2 of each of these. At the trial level, we can model incongruence and uncertainty, so whether it's an incongruent or congruent policy stance. And again, that is operationalized in terms of whether it's consistent or inconsistent with the party stereotype for that candidate. Uncertainty then is operationalized through the what we give them in the queue. So either they definitely or may support the issue or oppose the issue. The evaluation is what the participant tells us they think about that, so good or bad. And then we also look at participant ideology in the second half of the data that I'll show you today. Just measured from 1 to 6, very liberal to very conservative. Okay, so in terms of how we analyze the data, I was just going to talk about this very briefly, but if people have other questions about MRI data analysis in particular, I can certainly talk more about that in the Q&A. We do look both at the behavioral task data from the scanner as well as the MRI data itself. So for the behavioral task data, we look mainly at response latency, so how quickly people are making these decisions while in the scanner, and we model that as a function of block type and trial type. We also, in the second set of data I'll talk about, we look at this as a function of their response, so whether they said it was good or bad. And in that data, we look at it in relation to political ideology of the participant as well. With the MRI data, we use standard pre-processing steps in FSL for anyone who's familiar with MRI data. And then we conducted ROI analyses on our regions of interest, which included amygdala, insula, and anterior cingulate. These are all regions that are involved in evaluative processing or attitudes, affective processing. We didn't find any significant results with amygdala, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore, but I can speculate about that at the end if people have questions. I'm mainly going to focus on insula and anterior cingulate. With the MRI data, we do a similar model. So we model it as a function of block type and trial type, including both incongruence and uncertainty. And then in the second set of data, I'll also look at participant ideology. Okay, so that's a lot. Are there questions about the research design before I move on? Okay. So first I'm going to talk about some analyses we did just to look at the role of these differences in the type of information that people are processing. So how are people responding to information that's incongruent or inconsistent with the party stereotype? And how are they responding to information that's uncertain versus certain? And then we'll look at the interaction of these two as well. So the hypotheses guiding this initial data that I'm going to show you, or initial analyses that I'm going to show you, we expected to find that there would be greater activation to incongruent compared to congruent trials in amygdala, insula, and ACC. Our second hypothesis was that this activation to incongruent information should be moderated by uncertainty. And then third, we thought based on some prior research that activation to incongruent information would be moderated by group membership. So whether they were looking at an in-group versus an out-group target. In this first set of analyses, we don't find evidence for H3, so I'm not going to talk about that more here, but I'll come back to this when I look at political ideology with the next set of analyses in a minute. Okay, so first, this is data showing the main effects of uncertainty and incongruence in both anterior cingulate and insula. So I'll kind of walk you through what this is showing here. First, if you look at the activation that's plotted in blue on the figure, that is activation that was greater to incongruent compared to congruent trials. So we found a main effect of incongruence both in anterior cingulate, and that's depicted here on the left in blue, as well as in insula, and this was localized to right insula. So again, we saw activation greater for incongruent compared to congruent trials. And then we looked at the uncertainty versus certainty contrast, expecting that maybe we would find greater activation to uncertainty compared to certainty. We actually found the opposite. So we got no significant clusters for uncertainty being greater than certainty, but we did find some significant activation for just this main effect of certainty being greater than uncertainty, which is contrary to some prior work that's looked at anterior cingulate, for example, but this is qualified by an interaction effect, which I'll talk about next. So on these figures, the area plotted in orange or yellow is activation that was greater to certain trials compared to uncertain trials in our data. That was present in this sort of more anterior part of ACC, and then over here, it was also present bilaterally in insula. So these are kind of plotted on top of each other, but there was significant activation in insula on both the left and the right. Okay, so we thought that incongruence and uncertainty would interact based on prior work and based on some of our work in particular, looking at how the effects of uncertainty are context dependent. So again, we think that uncertainty might look different here when it's attached to congruent versus incongruent information, and that's what we find. So I'll show you first what the data looked like for anterior cingulate, and then we'll look at this for insula as well. Here on the right is the region in anterior cingulate that was significant for the interaction contrast in the model. So this is the region of ACC where the interaction effect was present, is the easiest way to think about it. We then plotted brain activation separately for each of the 4 trial types. So whether people are seeing a congruent versus incongruent trial down here at the bottom, and then in black versus gray are whether those trials were certain versus uncertain. And what the pattern of data shows us is that the greatest activation in anterior cingulate in our task was for those trials that were both incongruent and certain. So activation to those incongruent certain trials was quite a bit higher than activation to incongruent uncertain trials. And the difference is smaller for congruent trials, but it looks like it may be in the opposite direction. So here we don't see this big increase for certain trials over uncertain trials. If anything, it looks like people are maybe paying a little more attention to uncertain trials that are congruent. So we get this sort of interaction pattern in the data in anterior cingulate, where again, the greatest activation is to these certain incongruent trials. Now, if we look at the effect in insula, we actually see a very similar pattern of results. So we get a significant interaction of uncertainty and incongruence that's present in both left and right insula. So just to orient you to this figure, the top row shows data for left insula, and then the bottom row shows the data for right insula. So left and right here are plotted separately. The interaction effect was present for both. It looks like from the data, it may have been a little bit stronger on the right side than the left side, but the same general pattern is there, and this matches the pattern that we saw for anterior cingulate. So greatest activation for certain incongruent trials, especially relevant to uncertain incongruent trials, and then the pattern for congruent trials looks a bit different. If anything, more activation to uncertain compared to certain trials. So evidence that people are attending differently to congruent versus incongruent trials, and that the uncertainty effect really differs as a function of what type of information the uncertainty is attached to. So some additional evidence for this idea that uncertainty is context dependent. Now, when we look at the behavioral task data, so this is just response latency, how quickly were people making decisions in the scanner, we actually see a very similar pattern in terms of how long they're taking to make decisions. So this is some suggestion that what might be going on in insula and ACC could be consistent with the idea that they are taking longer to respond on those trials. So on certain incongruent trials, and these are statistically significant, although not substantially huge differences in reaction time. So the interaction effect is significant, but again, they're not, it's small in terms of the number of milliseconds it's taking them, but they are taking longer to decide whether it's good or bad on those certain incongruent trials compared to the others. Okay. So in the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about ideological differences in political cognition. We're going to use the same data set and look now at whether this looks different for liberal versus conservative participants in our sample. Now, in these analyses, given that we have a sample that's around 60 participants, but that's not huge, and we're trying to look for liberal conservative differences. So we simplified the analysis, and we're not looking at uncertainty in these analyses. So we control for uncertainty, but in the analyses I'll show you next, we're just really focusing on whether liberals and conservatives respond differently to information that's incongruent. So we still control for uncertainty, but we focus on whether they show differences in processing incongruent information. And then we also still include block type. So does this matter in terms of whether they're looking at in-group versus out-group candidates? I should say, in the analyses I just showed you with incongruence and uncertainty, we also look at block type. And block type didn't really matter for those effects. So those effects didn't really differ substantially depending on whether people were looking at an in-group versus an out-group candidate. But they did matter more when we started looking at political ideology. So I'll show you that next. Okay, so before I get into the data, it's worth talking about what existing literature has suggested about ideological differences in political cognition. And there's a growing body of literature on cognitive differences associated with political ideology, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. Some of this work has shown differences in conflict detection and response inhibition. So the Amodio paper, for example, from 2007, looked at this with EEG and a go, no-go task. So kind of looking at whether people can inhibit their responses, and found, I think in that task, that liberals were more likely to engage the anterior cingulate and were maybe a bit better at the response inhibition task than were conservatives, or conflict detection, I should say, was kind of what they focused on in that task. There's also some work that suggests there may be differences in responses to ambiguous or uncertain information. There's a paper showing maybe differences in relation to cognitive dissonance. And then, of course, there's a body of literature from some of my colleagues, as well as others, that suggests that liberals and conservatives show differences in emotion-related processing, including responses to negative stimuli like threat or disgusting images, for example. And in the realm of political neuroscience, there are really just a handful of studies, but kind of a growing number of studies that suggest there may be both structural and functional brain differences in amygdala, insula, and anterior cingulate. So some of the same regions that we're already interested in because they're involved in affective or evaluative processing. So we thought it would be worth looking to see whether liberals and conservatives showed different performance in this task that we had people do in the scanner. And to look at this, again, we model block type, so in-group versus out-group blocks, trial type, and here we're just looking at incongruent versus congruent for these analyses. We do control for uncertainty in the analysis as well. And then we add political ideology, so participant political ideology as a moderator, and look at that in relation to neural activation. So we add a fourth hypothesis here to this list, that activation to incongruent information will be moderated by political ideology. We were a bit agnostic as to the direction of this. So given past research, we thought that maybe liberals would be more likely to respond to incongruent information if you think about this as being similar to a conflict detection task. So similar to that paper that showed that liberals perform better in the go, no-go task. If this is like conflict detection, then maybe liberals would do a little bit better in the task. But on the other hand, if incongruence is viewed as negative or somehow threatening, then maybe this negativity hypothesis is relevant. And maybe we might expect conservatives to attend more to those sorts of trials. So given the literature, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect the opposite. And so we kind of went into this thinking that, we don't really know enough to predict for sure what this is going to look like. And we thought it could go potentially in either direction. Okay, so what we found in these analyses is a significant interaction of incongruence, so whether trials were congruent versus incongruent, with block type, so whether people are looking at an in-group versus an out-group candidate, and political ideology. So we're looking at a three-way interaction here. Basically, what we're finding is that liberals and conservatives did engage differently with the task. And the main thing that we find is that liberals engaged in greater activation in both insula, down here on the bottom, and anterior cingulate up here in the top row. And what we found was that liberals showed greater activation to incongruent compared to congruent trials, but that effect was mainly present for in-group candidates. So when a liberal or Democrat was looking at a Democratic candidate, they were more likely to differentiate or show different levels of processing for incongruent trials. So this just suggested that liberals were kind of differentiating more between these trial types than were conservatives in the sample. On this figure, I know this is a lot to look at. On the x-axis is participant ideology ranging from 1 to 6. So liberals are on the left here and conservatives are on the right. And then this in the top row is activation in the anterior cingulate, and the bottom row is activation in insula. On the left for in-group candidates and on the right for out-group candidates. And then the lines represent trial type, so congruent versus incongruent trials. So basically the data that supports what I just said is if you look at the left side of these in-group boxes, liberals are showing the greatest amount of differentiation or differential activation for those trials compared to conservatives, kind of on the other end. And then this effect was largest in these in-group blocks, where you see a difference between liberals and conservatives. Okay, so I'm going to show you the behavioral task data next, and this is, you know, I'm sorry, this is complicated, but that's the nature of the study we designed. So this is what that data looks like. To start with, just look at the graph on the left. And this is response latency data. So how quickly people were making these good, bad decisions. And the figure is laid out roughly similar to what we just looked at. So participant ideology is on the x-axis. Here, congruent versus incongruent is in the left boxes versus the right boxes. In-group blocks are at the top, out-group blocks at the bottom. And then now this is separated by good versus bad response. The main thing I want you to take away from this is just that just as we showed that liberals showed greater activation to incongruent relative to congruent trials on the previous slide, they're also showing more differentiation in their reaction times. So they took longer to respond on incongruent trials, and they were quicker to respond on congruent trials. And that was especially true when they were looking at in-group candidates. So they show more deviation in how quickly versus how slowly they're responding on those trials in a way that's consistent with or kind of similar to the pattern that we observe in the brain data. And then on the right, this is the actual response that they made. And this is just frequency data. So did they say it was good versus bad in terms of what they thought about the candidate? And the main take-home message from this too is just that our liberal participants were differentiating more in their evaluative responses. So they were basically more likely to show a bias toward either saying things were good or bad, whereas our conservative participants were more likely to show kind of a 50-50 split. So liberals on the left in each of these boxes were showing more differentiation than conservatives on the right. So again, the story here is that they showed more difference in the brain activation, more difference in response times, and more difference in the type of response that they were making as a consequence. Okay, so let me talk just briefly to kind of summarize our findings and talk about implications in future directions. And then hopefully I'll leave plenty of time for questions. Okay, so what do we find overall? We find evidence for the idea that neural processing of incongruent and or uncertain information looks different in the brain. So we found evidence for greater responses to incongruent compared to congruent information in both anterior cingulate and insula. Again, we got no effect in amygdala. I should say there may have been a main effect of incongruence in amygdala, but we didn't find any interaction effect. So we don't really talk about amygdala too much in the paper, just because there didn't seem to be much going on with this task. And again, we can talk more about that if people are interested in that specifically. We find that the impact of uncertainty is context dependent. So the greatest activation in our task was to certain incongruent trials in these same regions, ACC and insula. And then in the second set of analyses I showed you, we looked at ideological differences in political cognition. We find that political ideology is associated with neural differences in evaluating incongruent information. In particular, we found this in regions involved in evaluative processing that have also been implicated in past work looking at ideological differences. So that included insula and ACC. People do attend to incongruent candidate information, but in these analyses, we suggest that it may be more likely for our Democratic participants than Republican participants. I'm hesitant to say that would always be the case just because, we do have a small sample of people from Nebraska. So we don't know if there was something different, systematically different about the Democrats we recruited compared to the Republicans we recruited that could explain this. So I don't want to say that this is always the case, but this is what we find evidence for, at least in this study. So implications, we suggest that people do attend to uncertainty in political information, but the nature of that attention may vary as a function of context or the type of information that it's attached to. So people, at least in this context, when it was attached to uncertainty was attached to incongruent information, it seemed like people were just more likely to dismiss or ignore that information. What we suggest is that, for politicians, if they do hold incongruent issue positions, it might in some cases be strategic for them to deploy uncertainty or kind of mask their true stance on the issue, given what our data suggests. So again, this might be going a bit beyond what we've actually shown in the data, but it just suggests that people do attend more when these deviations are known to be definite, as opposed to if somebody says that a candidate, might not be consistent with the party on the issue, people might be more likely to ignore that. We're also interested in whether preferences for certain versus uncertain information might shift when the broader political context becomes uncertain. And we haven't looked at this yet in relation to the brain data, but work in my lab has kind of looked at these broader societal phenomenon in relation to how threat changes over time and how threat impacts political cognition over time. So I think we're really interested in whether these effects that we get in a task like this, might also shift over time as a function of kind of what else is going on politically. So if we're in the middle of a tumultuous election, or if we're in the midst of a global pandemic, for example, maybe people's preferences are going to shift and maybe they'll want more certain information and be more bothered by uncertainty, for example. In the future, we also have a number of different ways that we hope to expand on this work. So we want to look at this in relation to different types of uncertainty or ambiguity. In the task, we were sort of agnostic as to where the uncertainty was coming from. So we didn't really tell participants, they were told that the politician definitely or may support or oppose the issue, but we didn't really say whether that was something internal to the candidate or if that was just, a lack of information maybe out there in the political sphere. So there could be different ways in which uncertainty arises. Politicians might be undecided on an issue, or they might be trying to project uncertainty strategically. So in the future, it might be interesting to try to disentangle these different types of uncertainty. We're also interested in looking at the role of additional moderators, so things like political knowledge or from social psychology, need for cognition, other kinds of variables that might influence people's interest in engaging with information. And then, of course, we need to make this kind of more impactful for people in political science, and we want to look at trying to connect this neural activation to political behavior and specific outcomes like vote choice, for example. So we have run a small follow-up study where we ran a similar design, but then we had people vote, again, for hypothetical candidates, but we had people vote for them just so we can start to look at whether this neural activation, how they're responding to candidates' deviations has negative electoral impact for them. And we haven't analyzed that data yet, but that's one of the things we want to look at in the future. And then look at examining additional regions in the evaluative network. So, I think regions of prefrontal cortex would also be relevant for a task like this, and we just haven't really looked at that yet. Okay, so that's it. I do want to acknowledge my collaborators on this work. Both are former students of mine. Frank Gonzalez is now an assistant professor at the University of Arizona, and Melissa Baker is finishing up her PhD at UC Merced, and she'll be a postdoc at University of Toronto starting this fall. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Ingrid. So I'm supposed to be moderating this Q&A session. So if things get too out of control, we can do like a raised hand thing, like Devlin is doing already, or people can just speak up. But you're first, Devlin.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk, Ingrid. And I wanted to ask whether the findings that you have about Democrats, that they are more activated in these brain regions of decision making, and also take longer time, whether it has to do with the reality of political variance that they are confronted with. In other words, you conducted this study in the time when Trump was in power, I assume, right? Because is that correct or not?
That's a good question. I think this data might have actually been collected
earlier
in 2015.
Yeah. Okay, so it was at the time of the primary, maybe. But anyway, it was a time when there was a lot of variance within the Republican Party about what people said, and they were breaking certain stereotypes of which opinions Republicans held at the time. And so I'm just wondering, to what extent are your findings a reflection potentially of that reality of being used to these differences in reality within the politicians versus like a different functioning of the brain regions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think, at this point, we just don't know. It's hard to know which it could be. So it could be the case maybe that there's more variation in, and I don't know if this is what you were suggesting exactly, but it could be the case that there's more variation in the Democratic Party. And so Democrats might be more practiced perhaps at kind of looking for these sorts of deviations if they're maybe trying to pick between candidates that are more different. Now, I think in the Trump era, this might have looked different because then Republicans are having potentially more conflict within their party. And I do think this data was collected prior to that. So maybe, having more conflict happening at the time in your party might change what type of information you're attending to. So I do think it could shift over time in that way. Now, on the kind of question of whether or not these might be static differences in relation to neural processing, I think there is some suggestion that ACC and insula are regions that have shown differences in other types of tasks and differences potentially in brain structure. So there are other studies that have showed greater activation for ACC for liberals, for example. And I think there's the structural work, I think, found a difference in insula, although that maybe wasn't replicated, where liberals had more gray matter volume in insula. So this is why it's hard to know, because there are a couple existing studies that suggest that these regions might show differences in liberals versus conservatives in other types of tasks, which might make it seem more like, maybe there is some kind of personality type ideological difference going on there. But then I do think you're also correct that it might shift over time as a function of what's happening within the party and kind of how people are attending to information and at any given time. So I suspect it may be a combination of both of those, but we just need more work to try to disentangle those.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation, which transported me out of my zone of comfort. But one issue that you stated at the very beginning of your presentation is that in the context of increasing polarization, it's important to understand how people process political information and to better understand political evaluations. And at the end of the day, I wonder what are the implications of your findings for people who may be concerned to decrease polarization. Are there some implications regarding the way that we should present information or the way that we frame information? Could you elaborate a bit more about that kind of implications?
Yeah, so I do think that we still have quite a bit of work to do before I would want to make recommendations, real recommendations to policymakers or something like that. I do think what this suggests is that at least in some cases, people are paying attention to these cases where candidates are deviating from expectations. And in relation to what I set up at the beginning of the talk, we think that this may be problematic if it means that the public is somehow sort of policing this among our elected officials in a way that we're punishing people when they do deviate. When, like I argued, maybe this is sort of necessary in some cases for political compromise. So this is why we want to look at the implications of this for electoral outcomes, for example. So if people are showing this greater activation in ACC and insula to these sorts of deviations, are they then less likely to vote for the candidate? And we haven't looked at that yet, like I mentioned, but I think then we'd be able to say that there are negative electoral consequences when people do this. And then, we probably need kind of an additional step to look at maybe how we reduce this. So maybe can we emphasize to participants, the importance of democratic norms, perhaps, before they engage in a task like this? And maybe then we'd find that they are more forgiving of candidates or elected officials who deviate. And now this is pretty far removed from what we've actually done so far, but I think that would be really interesting to look at, whether there's a way in which we can, kind of diminish this this response people are having and try to get them to be less polarized in how they're evaluating candidates. So I hesitate to make practical recommendations yet, but I think those are some of the steps we could take to look at, given that we can see that this is what's happening in the brain, how can we then kind of diminish it if it is having, normatively negative outcomes?
May I ask a second question?
Yeah, sure.
In many of your graphs, you presented the impact of these variables according to participant ideology. And it seems that your models are mostly linear from liberal to conservative people. Do you believe that we may have a different expectation that the impact could be different for people who have weak partisan affiliation, like independent people, in contrast with those who are strongly liberal or conservative?
Yes, that's a great question. And we haven't looked at that yet in the brain data, in part because we're dealing with relatively small sample size. But I would love to be able to look at that in the future, because I do think, we're sort of setting this up as an identity related question. I've done some other work like looking at political identity as a social identity. And so I think from that perspective, yes, extremity of attachment should matter. So those more extreme partisans should maybe be more likely to punish deviations than people who are closer to the middle. So I hope to be able to look at that in the future, given more money for larger sample sizes in MRI. That's a great question.
Hey, Ingrid, I have a question too. So we're framing this as you had like blocks where you just told them this was like our in-group or out-group, essentially. Then you had uncertainty. about topics. I was wondering to what extent you thought that uncertainty was just like an additional signal of whether you're on my team or not. Meaning like they're like two simultaneous cues of group membership, and that's why you're getting highest activation towards certain outgroup members because they're like confident in their enemyness, like the things that to you make them like part of the other team. And I guess like when they're an in-group member, the uncertainty is that which is making you consider whether they're on your team or not. I don't know. So like, I guess I'm curious about like the construct of certainty. Do you think it's something unique to certainty, or do you think it's about just like, here are some additional signals in the environment that signal whether you're on my team or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess that might be, I mean, you could think of that as maybe another, like, I think that would still be uncertainty, but maybe a different type of uncertainty. So the way we did this was to label, like before each block started, they saw a picture of a face. These were just like generic faces that we selected. And that was labeled as a Democrat or a Republican. So that was their signal that this person is a member of their party or not. And so I do think what you suggest could be part of how they're responding to the uncertain trials, where they're just maybe less certain about that candidate's role within the party. Although I wonder if that would be more the case at kind of the outset of each block. So by the end of the block, given the way we structured it, like you're mostly getting stuff that's consistent with the party. So I think by the end of the block, it should be clearer to people that that person is definitely in the party, even if they're not kind of perfectly representing the party, if that makes sense, because there is a bias in the information where more of the information is congruent. So I guess I don't know, I don't know for sure how participants are thinking about the uncertainty. We kind of imagined that they would be thinking of it more in terms of like a lack of clarity in the information environment. So, this person is a Democrat, but we don't know for sure what their position is on the issue. So, yeah, so I guess I'm not sure exactly how to answer your question. I do think it could be interesting to try to get a handle on whether there's uncertainty about like whether or not the person's really in the group, as opposed to uncertainty about the issue position. And that's just, I don't know how we would look at that exactly, but that might be something we could try to do in the future too.
Actually, I think you helped resolve it for me. I was incorrect about your design. I was thinking it was kind of like candidate issue certainty over and over again, and I didn't realize that it was like candidate, and then you have a bunch of issues about which there's like certainty or not. And so I think that totally supports like interpretation that it's just like pure uncertainty about issues rather than like group membership or something.
Okay, sorry, I may not have been clear about that when I set up the study, but yes, it was candidate was at the block level, so each set of trials just focused on one particular candidate.
Also, just as like a follow-up, just like a small one, what were the topics that you were showing the people, and like how did you develop those? Like the things on which they were certain or not certain about?
Yeah, so there's a list of policy statements that really varied. So some social issues, some economic issues, a few foreign policy issues, and this was kind of, so I developed a set of issues that we've used in other work, and those were validated with some pilot data. And then for this project, we kind of updated the list and then piloted them again. So we selected issues that, based on pilot data, were more likely to be associated with a Democrat or a Republican. And then we tried to balance the issues so that we had, some social, some economic, and didn't have duplicates. And then we set this up. So the way it was set up was that the candidates for the congruent issues, it would pull, we had like a Democratic list and a Republican list. For congruent, it would pull from the same party list, and then for incongruent, it would pull from the other party list. And we set it up so people weren't seeing duplicate issues and all of that in the task. So we piloted basically to see that these were usually thought of as being consistent with one party or the other.
Okay, I have just one final question. I'm not also. Are we over time right now for the record?
No, that is good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just was. So at the very beginning, you had talked about how sometimes uncertainty can be like a positive thing, and I was thinking hard about that until you gave your examples, which I think are good. But in the context of politics, I was wondering if you thought that held. Like we can think of some situations in which uncertainty is a positive thing, but do you think that that would extend to politics where uncertainty is ever a positive thing? And now I guess, okay, so I guess I don't mean the uncertainty of like the candidate. I guess I mean like uncertainty that would be like localized within me about something. Like, are people just individually seeking out uncertainty? I guess I would want my candidates to like be considering various issues. So I got muddled here. So let me just like say my question again. Do you think that uncertainty can be like a positive thing, specifically in the context of politics?
Yeah, so I think it's often easier for us to think of cases in which it's negative or threatening. But I think in the political psychology literature, there's this could potentially map on to some of the work that's looked at. Like hope, for example, is an emotion that comes to mind. So hope, psychologically speaking, has been defined as, thinking things aren't great right now, but being hopeful for positive change in the future. And I think there's some uncertainty attached to that, right? So you have an expectation that things are going to be positive, but within that, you may not know exactly how things are going to turn out. So I think there could be uncertainty present with that. For example, if you're a Democrat and Joe Biden wins the election, right? Maybe that changes your frame. So you're kind of expecting that things will get better, even if they're currently not great. But you still don't know exactly what Joe Biden's going to do, right? Like, is he going to forgive student loan debt or not? And how is he going to handle COVID-19? So I think there's still uncertainty, but in this example, I guess, like the party in power or your expectation of who the president is and what they're going to do can change that context from a negative one to maybe a more positive one in terms of what your expectations are. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that was what came to mind, I guess, as you were asking it.
That does answer my question. Thank you.
I have another follow-up, if that's okay. Is that okay, Eric?
Yeah, of course. Thanks.
So I think you've discussed it before, but I just want to kind of be more clear on it in a way. When you show that Democrats have activate more with incongruent statements, do you take that as kind of a higher, like, of an inability to deal with or have a harder time with political difference or political diversity in a way? Would you go as far as indicating that Democrats have a harder time dealing with it than Republicans? Would that be one of the conclusions to be drawn?
Yeah, I think that is kind of how we're thinking about it. So I didn't really talk very much, specifically about what ACC and Insula are doing, but ACC is sort of, it's thought to have multiple roles, but part of what we think it does is kind of signal conflict and the need for additional processing. So we think that Democrats in our sample are engaging more with this information. And then the activation of Insula, sometimes it's been talked about in relation to negative emotion, but other research suggests it's just kind of integrating affect with cognition. So maybe there is some sort of emotional response to the information, and that's attached to kind of how people are wanting to engage with it more. So we think what the Democrats in the sample are doing is paying more attention to this information. Maybe they're more bothered by it. We haven't really done a careful analysis yet to see if they're, like, they should be then more likely to say that position is bad. That's kind of what I would expect to find, but we haven't looked at that exactly yet. And then I would presume that they're going to be more punitive in terms of not liking the candidates who do that. So I do think that this pattern of data would be consistent with saying that they're more bothered by these deviations or less able to ignore them, whereas maybe for the Republicans in the sample, they're seeing it and they're just ignoring it because I can't speculate exactly about what the thought process is there, but maybe they care more about the group membership or something like that. And so then they're just ignoring the specific pieces of policy information. So yes, I think, we don't know for sure yet, but the way I'm thinking about it is consistent with what you said, I think.
Yeah, I find this quite interesting for, political tolerance and for democracy in general, what democracy should be about. Obviously we do see, other problems as well, but I think that's a really interesting insight in a way that potentially goes, very deep to kind of affecting even beyond the unconscious, what's happening in the brain also affects maybe physiological responses and so on. And but you don't find any effect on the amygdala, which is also interesting. So no affective, emotional response necessarily to it.
Yeah. So the
oh, that's a very political science way of talking about it. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So insula could, like the insula activation doesn't necessarily mean there's an emotional response, but insula could be consistent with an affective response. We don't know for sure why we're not finding big differences in amygdala, but one possibility is just the nature of the task. So amygdala tends to show activation when people are making like very, very quick decisions, if they're looking at faces or pictures or kind of like more rapid stimuli like that. So it could even be the case that even though 5 seconds is still pretty fast, because we're having people like read and think about information, that might just be less likely to engage amygdala than these kind of slightly more higher order processes within the brain. So if that makes sense. So I think part of maybe why we're not finding amygdala is just because of the nature of the task being a little more cognitive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay.
All right, well, if anybody else has questions, now the time, but if not, we can wrap it up. I do actually, Wim, if you could present the thank you gift for Ingrid.
The tradition is to give you a cup with the poster. Do you see it?
Yes, it's slightly blurry, but I can see it.
Okay.
That's very nice.
And
Thank you.
I will email you for your address in the next few days.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the gift.
That's for not being here and going out for a nice dinner.
I know. I'm very sad that I'm not actually in Montreal in person because I would love to visit.
Yeah, it's actually
hopefully someday.
Lovely day too.
Yeah, hopefully someday I'll be there in person.
Hope so too.
Well, thank you all for all these really great questions too. It's been a pleasure to join you today. So.
All right. Thank you, Ingrid, for coming, and thank you, everybody. I guess we can take care.
Thank you.